They say that time waits for no one, but on the quiet, crooked corner of Main Street, time doesn't just slow down, it limps, drags its feet, and sometimes seems to stop altogether, as if even the seconds are tired of leaving. In a small workshop tucked away from the neon glow of the modern world, the air is a thick, comforting soup of cedar shavings, aged machine oil, and the faint, metallic tang of brass. Here, time does not rush toward a deadline. It moves with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a master at work. I find myself staring at a faded photograph of Silas Thorne, his eyes crinkled in a permanent smile behind thick spectacles. The photo is yellowed at the edges, curled by the humidity of decades, yet his presence in the room remains as tangible as the heavy oak workbench he reclaimed from a closed-down factory 40 years ago. He is a man who spent 50 years of his life repairing the things that the rest of the world decided to throw away. He did not just fix gears and springs, he preserved the moments attached to them. To many, he was just a repairman, but to those who knew him, he was a keeper of history. But today, the very air in his shop feels heavy. The silence is no longer peaceful. It is a warning. Silas's legacy, built one heartbeat of a clock at a time, is facing a giant that does not care about the past. I wonder if a single man can hold back the tide of progress when it threatens to wash away everything he loves. The change began on a Tuesday morning. A sleek, black car that looked like a polished beetle pulled up right in front of Thorne's timeless repairs. The engine didn't even make a sound. Out stepped a man wearing a suit that likely cost more than Silas's entire inventory of spare parts. This was Mr. Henderson, a developer from the city. He didn't come with tools. He came with a leather briefcase and a very generous offer. He spoke about luxury glass towers and high-speed internet hubs. He let his gaze wander upward, tracing the intricate spiderweb of cracks in the ceiling plaster and the deep, oil-darkened grooves of the ancient workbench with a look of clinical distaste, as if he were examining a stain on an otherwise pristine white floor. To a man like Henderson, these walls were merely structural obstacles occupying a prime geographic coordinate. Yet for a fleeting second, his gaze lingered on a small, hand-carved wooden bird on a high shelf. His thumb twitched as if remembering the texture of a toy from a half-forgotten childhood, before his face hardened back into a mask of clinical distaste. He saw no history in the dust, only inefficiency. In his mind, this entire block was already a ghost, a simple square on a digital map waiting to be deleted with a single keystroke and redrawn into something profitable, sleek, and entirely hollow. He laid a contract on the counter, right next to a disassembled music box. Silas looked at the paper, then at the man's eyes, which were as cold as new steel. If he signed this, the heartbeat of the town would stop, but if he didn't, he might lose everything anyway. Silas looked down at his hands. They were weathered and stained with oils that no soap could ever fully remove. His joints ached more than usual in the morning dampness, a constant reminder of the decades spent hunched over a magnifying glass. He felt the weight of his age pressing down on his shoulders. Maybe the modern world was right. Maybe a man who still listens for the soft breathing of a ticking watch has no place in a world that only notices things when a screen lights up and then goes dark again. He thought about the ease of retirement, of never having to worry about a stubborn mainspring again. He picked up the heavy fountain pen Henderson offered. The nib hovered just a fraction of an inch above the signature line. His heart told him to fight, but his tired bones whispered that it was time to let go. He wondered if anyone would even notice if the shop vanished tomorrow. As his hand trembled, Silas looked at a newspaper clipping pinned to his wall. It mentioned a new reality of our modern age. He remembered the ghosts of this town, the faces of men and women who had stood at his counter with broken treasures held in trembling hand. They didn't come to him for a service. They came to retrieve a piece of their lives that had gone quiet. If he let Henderson's ink touch that paper, he wasn't just clearing a lot. He was evicted those memories, turning the town's history into a pile of anonymous rubble and dust that would be swept away by the morning. The town wouldn't just be modernized, it would be hollowed out, leaving a hole where its heart used to beat. Henderson tapped the face of his watch, a silent obsidian slab, and the blue light bled onto the contract. "Time's a resource, Silas," he muttered, his voice dropping to a dry, practiced sympathetic tone. "Don't waste it on a pile of rot." Silas didn't look at the paper. He looked at a grease stain on the man's cuff that Henderson hadn't noticed yet. That stain was real. The man's promises weren't. Silas felt the phantom weight of every clock in the room, their collective ticking suddenly sounding like a heartbeat under interrogation. He realized then that he wasn't just holding a pen. He was holding the fate of everything that still had a soul in this zip code in the palm of his hand. He set the pen down. not because he was a hero, but because his fingers simply refused to grip it anymore. Just as the ink was about to touch the paper, the shop door's brass bell let out a frantic chime. It wasn't a customer looking for a battery. It was Mrs. Gable, the town's librarian for the last 40 years. She was breathless, her coat buttoned crookedly. "Silas," she gasped, gripping the edge of the wooden counter. "It's the great clock in the square. It stopped." Silas felt a cold shiver. That clock hadn't stopped since the end of the Great War. It was the North Star of the town. "The mayor is in a panic," she continued. "The New Year's Eve gala is tomorrow night. The whole county is coming, and the televised countdown depends on that clock. Nobody else knows how it works. Silas, only you." The developer cleared his throat, looking annoyed by the interruption. Silas looked from the contract to Mrs. Gable's worried face. The choice was no longer just about his shop. Mr. Henderson didn't shout or act like a villain from a cartoon. He simply sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "Mr. Thorne," he said softly, "be realistic. That clock hasn't been properly serviced in 40 years because it is a relic. It is a beautiful dinosaur, but it is still a dinosaur. Sign the paper. You can retire in a house with central heating and never climb another stairs in your life. Why would you struggle for a town that only remembers you exist when something finally breaks?" There was a kindness in his voice that was almost harder to fight than anger. He truly believed he was doing Silas a favor by helping him quit. He didn't see the beauty in the struggle. He only saw the efficiency of the replacement. Silas looked at the man and realized they were speaking two different languages. Silas didn't sign the paper. He laid the pen down with a steady hand. He reached under the counter and pulled out his old leather tool roll, the one his father had given him. The leather was soft and dark from years of use. He didn't say a word to the developer. He simply nodded to Mrs. Gable and walked out into the cold afternoon air. His silhouette looked small and fragile against the backdrop of the rising skyscrapers in the distance. Every step toward the town square felt like a mile. His knees clicked, and his breath came in short bursts, but he kept moving. He reached the base of the great stone clock tower. He hadn't climbed those narrow, winding wooden stairs in over 10 years. He looked up into the darkness of the tower, wondering if his body would fail him before he reached the top. The climb was grueling. Dust motes danced in the dim light of his flashlight. When he finally reached the bell chamber, he was met by the massive heart of the machine. The tower's inner works loomed over him like the ribcage of a sleeping iron beast. His father used to call this the deadbeat, a mechanism that didn't care about the howling gale outside or the snow piling up on the external hands. It just demanded perfection. Silas wiped a smudge of black grease onto his trousers, his breath hitching as he leaned into the freezing gears. He could feel the cold radiating off the iron, a deep, biting chill that seeped through his thin wool coat and settled right into his marrow, making every movement a calculated battle against his own stiffening joints. As Silas opened the heavy iron housing, he saw the gears frozen in a silent scream. He began to inspect every tooth and pivot. Then he found it. A single, tiny brass pin, no larger than a matchstick, had sheared off. It had simply reached its limit after a century of constant motion. It was a small failure that had paralyzed a giant. Silas searched his tool roll, his heart sinking. He didn't have a spare pin of that exact gauge. He looked around the dusty floor, hoping a previous caretaker had left a spare, but there was nothing. He scavenged through the corners of the bell chamber, kicking up clouds of choking dust. He found only the debris of a world that had moved on, a rusted hinge and a discarded bird's nest. Down in the square, the town moved to a digital pulse, oblivious to the 3 tons of iron hanging over their heads, while Silas stood in the dark, a ghost trying to haunt a world that had stopped believing in spirits. His lungs burned with the cold, and for a second he considered just sitting down in the dust and letting the clock stay dead. He was a man out of time, trying to fix a machine the world had forgotten how to value. He felt the cold iron of the gears under his fingers and felt like he was failing not just the town, but his own father. He sat on a wooden crate, catching his breath. His hand went to his vest pocket, touching the smooth surface of his own silver pocket watch. It was his father's watch, handed down through 3 generations of Thornes. It was the most precious thing he owned, more valuable to him than the shop or the land it sat on. He pulled it out and clicked the lid open. The ticking was steady and brave. He looked at the sheared pin in the tower clock, then back at his watch. He knew that the internal pins in his father's watch were made of the same high-quality brass from the same era. with a hand that miraculously stopped trembling the moment his fingers brushed the familiar cold steel of his jeweler's screwdriver. Silas began the delicate, heartbreaking task of disassembling his family's most sacred legacy. Each screw he removed felt like a stitch being pulled from his own skin. He carefully extracted the tiny, gleaming brass pin, the very component that had kept his father's heart close to his own for a lifetime. He held the tiny piece of metal up to the lantern light, knowing that by saving the town's rhythm, he was silencing his own history. He was willing to break the only thing he had left of his past to ensure that the townspeople would have a future worth measuring. The wind began to howl through the wooden slats of the tower, making the massive structure groan. Silas worked by the flickering light of a single lantern. The tower clock's weights were hundreds of pounds of lead. If he released the tension incorrectly, the gear train would collapse and crush his hands. He worked with the focus of a surgeon. He thought of the developer's offer, the luxury, and the warmth. Then he thought of the quiet humanity he had seen in his shop over the years, the widow who just wanted her husband's watch to tick again, the boy who was fascinated by the spinning wheels. He fit the small brass pin from his own watch into the great clock's auxiliary strike release, the delicate gatekeeper that allowed the massive gears to engage. It was a fragile, desperate fit. With a soft, musical click, the metal seated, holding back the weight of a century with the strength of a legacy. He reached for the massive pendulum. He gave the pendulum a firm, steady push. The heavy brass disc began to swing. Swish, swish. Silas held his breath. The entire room seemed to hold its breath with him. The escapement wheel moved one tooth, then another. But then, a grinding sound echoed through the chamber. The old oil had thickened in the cold, and the new pin was under immense pressure. Silas watched the second hand through the inspection window. It trembled. It stayed still for a long second that felt like an hour. Would the small pin hold the weight of the giant? Or would his sacrifice be for nothing, leaving both his father's watch and the town's clock broken in the dark? Below in the square, a crowd had begun to gather. Word had spread that Silas was up in the tower. Even the mayor and Mr. Henderson were standing there, looking up. Suddenly, a deep, resonant thump vibrated through the stones of the square. Then another. The great clock began to strike the hour for its first test. The sound was rich and golden, a voice from the past speaking to the present. It wasn't the tinny beep of a phone. It was a physical force that people could feel in their chests. It was a reminder that they were all connected to the same moment. Mr. Henderson looked down at his silent digital watch, then up at the majestic tower. He saw the faces of the townspeople, lit with a sudden, shared joy. Silas walked down the stairs slowly. His legs were shaking, and his pocket felt light and empty where his watch used to be. When he stepped out of the tower door, he expected to see the developer waiting with the contract. Instead, there was a respectful, warm silence. The townspeople didn't cheer. They just opened a path for him. Mrs. Gable handed him a cup of hot cider, her eyes wet with tears. Mr. Henderson approached him. He didn't have the contract in his hand. He looked at Silas's oil-stained fingers and then at the tower. "I've spent my life building things that are designed to be replaced in 20 years, Henderson said quietly. "I think I forgot what it looks like to build something that lasts forever. Could you teach someone how to do that? Maybe we don't need to tear the block down. Maybe we need to restore it. If you were to walk past that crooked corner today, you would see that the shop is still there." Silas Thorne didn't retire to a lonely house. He turned his workshop into a school. He spends his days teaching young people that their hands are capable of more than just swiping on glass. He spends his mornings now with a young apprentice named Leo, a kid who used to spend all day staring at a phone until Silas put a pair of tweezers in his hand and told him to listen. You can see them through the window, two heads bowed over a single movement, the sunlight catching the brass gears. Silas doesn't talk much about integrity or community. He just shows the boy how to feel the tension in a spring and how to respect the metal. It's a slow, messy process, full of drop screws and frustrated sighs, but it's real. It's the kind of work that leaves your fingernails black and your back aching, but lets you sleep with the heavy, honest weight of a day well spent. The silver pocket watch is gone, but its heart now beats for the entire town to hear. The shop doesn't smell like a museum anymore. It smells like burnt coffee, Leo's cheap sneakers, and the same sharp tang of brass that's been there since the Great War. Sometimes the great clock in the square gains a second or loses one, and Silas has to limp up those stairs again to nudge the pendulum. He likes the imperfection of it. It's a reminder that nothing stays fixed forever. It just stays cared for. As the sun dips below the skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across the oak workbench. Silas finally puts his loop away. His hands are still stained, his knees still ache. But as the rhythmic thrum of the shop rises to meet the evening, he knows the silence isn't coming back yet. Not tonight.